On the morning of April 27th, 1521, in the warm shallows off a small coral island in the western Pacific, a man stood waist-deep in water the color of pale jade, watching his death approach across the reef. He was armored from throat to knee in steel plate that had been forged in the foundries of southern Spain, and he carried a sword that had served him in battles from the fortress walls of Morocco to the spice markets of Malacca. Around him, the water churned with the desperate movements of his men, perhaps 40 of them, struggling to keep their footing on the slippery coral while hundreds of warriors closed in from every direction. The air was thick with the hum of bamboo arrows and the splash of thrown spears. Somewhere behind him, too far away to help, his ships floated helplessly beyond the reef, their cannons unable to reach the shore. He had made a mistake, and he knew it. And he knew also that there was no way back to the boats, no retreat possible through that gauntlet of obsidian-tipped weapons and screaming men. So he did what he had done all his life when the situation turned impossible. He turned to face the enemy, raised his sword, and fought. His name was Ferdinand Magellan, and what he had accomplished in the 2 years before this moment would reshape humanity's understanding of the planet it lived upon. He had sailed west from Spain, with 5 ships and roughly 270 souls, bearing the commission of the Spanish crown to find what no one had ever found, a passage through the unknown continent that blocked the western route to Asia. He had found that passage, threading his ships through a nightmare labyrinth of rock and ice at the southern tip of the world, a strait that would forever bear his name. He had then crossed an ocean so vast that he himself, upon first seeing its endless calm expanse, had wept and given it the name by which we still know it today, the Pacific, the peaceful sea. He had done what Christopher Columbus had dreamed of doing and failed, what Vasco da Gama had never attempted, what the finest navigators of Portugal and Spain had declared impossible. He had sailed west and reached the east, and now he was going to die in the shallow water of a reef he had never heard of, on an island that would not appear on European maps for another generation, killed by people whose names and language and gods he did not know, for reasons that had nothing to do with the great project of his life. The warriors of Mactan Island drove their spears into the gaps of his armor. They struck at his legs, which were unprotected below the knee. They knocked away his helmet and aimed for his face. An Italian gentleman named Antonio Pigafetta, who had sailed with Magellan from Spain and who was watching from a few yards away, would later write that his captain was struck by a bamboo spear in the right leg, by a scimitar blow across his left leg, and that he fell face forward into the water while the men around him fled toward the boats. The warriors descended upon his body. They hacked at him with their Campolan swords until he stopped moving. The warm water of the reef turned pink and then red. He was perhaps 40 years old. He had sailed farther west than any European in history. He had proven that the world was round, that the oceans were connected, that the earth was incomprehensibly larger than anyone had imagined. He had done all this, and he died in water so shallow that a child could have stood in it, on a beach he had no reason to visit, in a battle he had no need to fight. The men who found continents are not always the men who understand what they have found, and the men who change the world rarely live to see the world they've changed. This is the story of Ferdinand Magellan, the voyage he made, the passage he discovered, the ocean he named, and the death that waited for him on a coral reef at the edge of the known world. It is a story about obsession and navigation, about the terrible cost of great achievement, and about the strange fact that the man who first led an expedition around the globe never intended to go around the globe at all. He wanted only to reach the Spice Islands by sailing west, and to come home the same way he had come. The circumnavigation that bears his name was an accident, a desperate improvisation by his surviving crew, a byproduct of disaster. But before we can understand the voyage, we must understand the man. And before we can understand the man, we must understand the world that made him. The sources for Magellan's life are fragmentary, contradictory, and often hostile. The most important account of the voyage itself comes from Antonio Pigafetta, the Italian gentleman who sailed as a supernumerary and kept a detailed journal throughout the 3-year expedition. Pigafetta was an eyewitness to almost everything that happened, including Magellan's death. and his account has the texture of lived experience, the stench of rotting food, the taste of leather soaked in seawater, the sound of men dying of scurvy in the dark hold of a rolling ship. But Pigafetta admired Magellan intensely, perhaps loved him, and his account is colored by that devotion. He makes Magellan a hero at every turn. The Spanish and Portuguese sources are less kind. Both crowns had reason to resent Magellan, the Portuguese because he had defected to their rival and discovered a western route to the Spice Islands that threatened their monopoly. The Spanish because his voyage had cost them ships, men, and money, and because he had died before delivering on his promises. The official Spanish account, compiled after the voyage from the testimony of survivors, portrays Magellan as stubborn, cruel, and ultimately incompetent. The Portuguese chronicles are even harsher, painting him as a traitor who got what he deserved. Modern scholarship has done much to sift through these competing narratives. We have ship manifests and royal commissions and notarized contracts. We have letters that Magellan wrote and letters that were written about him. We have the logs of his officers, some of whom hated him and said so. We have archaeological evidence from the Strait of Magellan and the beaches of Mactan. We have, in short, enough to reconstruct the broad shape of what happened, even if we cannot always know what Magellan thought or felt or intended. What we know is this: he was born in northern Portugal, probably around 1480, into a family of minor nobility. He spent his childhood and youth in the service of the Portuguese crown, first as a page in the royal household, and then as a soldier in the eastern expeditions that made Portugal the first European power to trade directly with Asia. He served in India, in Malacca, in the Spice Islands themselves. He learned to navigate by the stars and to fight with sword and lance. He developed an obsession with the idea of reaching Asia by sailing west, an obsession that would consume the rest of his life. When the Portuguese king refused to support his scheme, he crossed the border into Spain, renounced his citizenship, and offered his services to the Spanish crown. And in 1519, with 5 small ships and a crew drawn from half the nations of Europe, he set sail for the end of the world. The Portugal that Ferdinand Magellan was born into was the most unlikely great power in European history. It was a small country, clinging to the Atlantic edge of the Iberian Peninsula, with a population of perhaps 1 million souls, and an economy based primarily on fishing, salt production, and the cultivation of olives and grapes. It had no great rivers navigable to the sea, no natural harbors to compare with the great Mediterranean ports, no deposits of gold or silver or iron to finance military ambitions. By any reasonable measure, it should have remained what it had always been, a minor kingdom on the periphery of European affairs, overshadowed by its larger and more powerful neighbor to the east, the Kingdom of Castile. But Portugal had one advantage that no other European nation possessed. It faced the Atlantic. The Mediterranean, which had been the highway of European civilization for 3,000 years, was by the 15th century a crowded and contested sea. The Italian city-states controlled its eastern trade routes. The Ottoman Turks, having conquered Constantinople in 1453, were steadily closing off European access to the overland routes to Asia. The spices that European nobles craved for their tables, the silk and porcelain and precious stones that marked the wealth of kings, all of these passed through Muslim hands, and each transfer added costs and middlemen and the ever-present risk of interruption. The merchant houses of Venice and Genoa grew rich on this trade, but they did so at the sufferance of powers they could not control. Portugal, facing west into the empty Atlantic, was ideally positioned to seek an alternative. And under the patronage of a remarkable royal prince named Henry, later called the Navigator, that is precisely what Portugal did. Prince Henry never himself sailed on a voyage of exploration. He spent most of his adult life in a compound on the windswept promontory of Sagres, at the southwestern tip of Portugal, gathering navigators, cartographers, astronomers, and shipbuilders, pressing them to solve the technical problems that had kept European sailors close to shore for centuries. His vision was at once commercial and religious. He wanted to find a sea route around Africa to the Indies, bypassing the Muslim middlemen entirely, and he wanted to spread Christianity to whatever peoples he found along the way. He died in 1460, decades before either goal was achieved. but the institutional momentum he created outlived him, and the expeditions continued under his successors. The advance down the African coast was agonizingly slow. Each cape, each bay, each river mouth had to be explored, charted, and assessed for commercial potential. The ships of the early expeditions were small and poorly suited to open ocean sailing, and the navigators had to learn by trial and error the patterns of wind and current that would allow them to return home against the prevailing northerlies. Portuguese sailors reached the Canary Islands, the Madeira Archipelago, the Azores, the coast of Senegal, the mouth of the Gambia, the Gulf of Guinea. They established trading posts where they could buy gold, ivory, and slaves from African merchants. They pushed farther and farther south, into waters where the stars changed and the familiar constellations dipped below the horizon. In 1488, a navigator named Bartolomeo Dias finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. 10 years later, in 1498, Vasco da Gama completed the passage to India, dropping anchor in the harbor of Calicut on the Malabar coast and establishing the first direct trade link between Europe and Asia. Portuguese ships flooded into the Indian Ocean, backed by cannons and an appetite for profit that astounded and horrified the established trading communities of the East. Within a decade, Portugal controlled fortresses at Goa, at Hormuz, at Malacca. Portuguese merchants reached the coast of China, the islands of Japan, the fabled spice islands of the Moluccas, where cloves and nutmeg grew in such abundance that their fragrance could be smelled for miles out to sea. This was the world that Ferdinand Magellan grew up in, a world where Portugal, with its tiny population and its rocky soil and its narrow strip of Atlantic coastline, had somehow become the master of global commerce. A world where wealth beyond imagining flowed into Lisbon harbor on the decks of small wooden ships that had sailed halfway around the planet. A world where a young man of noble birth but limited prospects could make his fortune by going east, to the lands of spice and silk and endless possibility. Magellan went east at the age of 25. The young man who sailed from Lisbon in the spring of 1505 was compact and strong, dark-complexioned in the manner of northern Portugal, with a thick black beard and a manner that contemporaries described as reserved, almost brooding. He was not tall, perhaps 5 feet 4 or 5, but he carried himself with the erect bearing of a trained soldier, and he had a reputation even then for physical courage that bordered on recklessness. He was serving as a sobresaliente, a supernumerary, aboard one of the 22 ships of the Armada of Francisco de Almeida, the first viceroy of Portuguese India. It was the largest fleet Portugal had ever sent east, and its mission was not merely to trade, but to conquer, to establish Portuguese control over the key choke points of the Indian Ocean trade, and to destroy anyone, European or Asian, who opposed them. For the next 8 years, Magellan lived the brutal life of a soldier in Portugal's Eastern Empire. He fought in the siege of Kilwa, on the East African coast, where Portuguese marines stormed the walls of the Sultan's palace and planted the cross on the minaret of the central mosque. He fought in the Battle of Diu, one of the most important naval engagements of the 16th century, where a combined fleet of Egyptian Mamluks, Gujarati Muslims, and Venetian advisors attempted to drive the Portuguese from the Indian Ocean and was annihilated by superior European gunnery. He served in the campaigns that established Portuguese control over the fortress of Goa, the gateway to the spice routes. He sailed to Malacca, the wealthy entrepot on the strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and fought in the assault that brought that city under Portuguese rule in 1511. The surviving documents give us glimpses of his life during these years. He was wounded at least twice, once seriously enough to leave him with a permanent limp. He was present at some of the most important events of Portuguese expansion. He developed a reputation as a competent officer who could be trusted with difficult assignments. He also began to accumulate the knowledge that would later make his great voyage possible. He learned the practical arts of celestial navigation, the mathematics of dead reckoning, the reading of wind and current, and the subtle signs that indicated approaching land. He learned Malay, the lingua franca of the eastern seas, well enough to conduct business and negotiation. He studied the maps and charts and sailing directions that Portuguese pilots had accumulated over decades of eastern voyaging. And he began to ask questions that his superiors did not want to hear. The Spice Islands, the Moluccas, lay at the eastern edge of the Portuguese sphere of influence, thousands of miles beyond Malacca, in waters that no European had systematically explored. They were a cluster of tiny volcanic islands, most of them no more than a few miles across, but they were the source of some of the most valuable commodities on Earth. Cloves grew only on the islands of Ternate and Tidore. Nutmeg and mace came only from the Banda Islands, a little archipelago so small and remote that it does not appear on most modern maps. These spices were worth more than their weight in gold in European markets, and the merchants who controlled the trade in them became fantastically wealthy. The Portuguese had reached the Moluccas in 1512, establishing a small trading post on Ternate, and they intended to monopolize the clove trade, just as they had monopolized the pepper trade of the Malabar coast. But there was a complication. In 1494, Spain and Portugal had signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the non-Christian world between them along a line of longitude running roughly through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Everything east of the line belonged to Portugal. Everything west belonged to Spain. The treaty had been drawn up to resolve disputes over Columbus's discoveries in the Caribbean, and at the time it was signed, no one had any clear idea how far east the eastern lands extended. Now, as Portuguese ships pushed deeper into the Pacific, the question became urgent. Where, exactly, did the line of Tordesillas fall on the other side of the world? The answer depended on measurements that 16th century technology could not accurately perform. Longitude, the east-west position of a point on the Earth's surface, could only be estimated by dead reckoning, by timing the eclipses of Jupiter's moons, or by sheer guesswork. Portuguese geographers, naturally, placed the Moluccas well within the Portuguese hemisphere. Spanish geographers, equally naturally, placed them within the Spanish sphere. The truth, which would not be established for another 2 centuries, was that the islands lay just barely on the Portuguese side of the line, but by so narrow a margin that the dispute would remain live for generations. Magellan, during his years in the East, became convinced that the Spanish were right. He believed, or claimed to believe, that the Moluccas lay within the Spanish hemisphere, and that Portugal's presence there was illegitimate. This was either a genuine intellectual conviction or a convenient rationalization for the plan that was forming in his mind. If the Spice Islands belonged to Spain, then Spain would pay well for someone who could show them how to get there without trespassing on Portuguese waters, and the only way to reach the Spice Islands without crossing Portuguese-controlled seas was to sail west. The idea of reaching Asia by sailing west was not original to Magellan. It was, in fact, one of the oldest dreams in European exploration. The ancient Greeks had known that the earth was round, and medieval scholars had preserved this knowledge even as they debated endlessly about the size of the globe and the distribution of land and water across its surface. Christopher Columbus had sailed west in 1492 specifically to reach the Indies, and he had died in 1506, still insisting that the lands he had discovered were the outer fringes of Asia, that Cuba was a peninsula of China, and that the gold of Hispaniola came from the mines of Cipangu, which is to say, Japan. By the time Magellan returned to Portugal in 1512 or 1513, it was becoming clear that Columbus had been wrong. The lands across the Atlantic were not Asia. They were something else entirely, a vast and previously unknown continent that stretched from the Arctic ice to the Antarctic ice, blocking the westward route to the Spices. Amerigo Vespucci, whose letters describing the new lands had given the continent its name, had sailed down the coast of South America and reported that it extended far to the south with no passage through. Vasco Núñez de Balboa had crossed the Isthmus of Panama in 1513 and become the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from its eastern shore, confirming that another ocean lay between the New World and Asia. But how big was that ocean? And was there a way through or around the South American continent? No one knew. The maps of the period show a chaos of speculation and wishful thinking. Some cartographers drew South America as a narrow projection with open water beyond. Others showed a continuous landmass extending to the Antarctic ice. Still others drew fantastical straits cutting through the continent at various latitudes, passages that might or might not exist. The Portuguese had explored the coast of Brazil, which lay within their sphere under the Treaty of Tordesillas, but they had little interest in finding a western route to lands they could already reach by sailing east. The Spanish had explored the Caribbean and the coasts of Central America, but their attempts to probe southward had been sporadic and inconclusive. Magellan became obsessed with the idea that a passage existed. The sources do not tell us exactly when or why this conviction took hold, but it seems to have crystallized during his years in the East. He had access to Portuguese charts and sailing directions that were closely guarded state secrets, and some modern historians have speculated that he may have seen evidence now lost of explorations along the South American coast that hinted at a strait. He may have spoken with sailors who had ventured into the cold waters of the southern Atlantic and reported deep bays or channels cutting into the land. Or he may simply have reasoned, correctly as it turned out, that a continent so long and narrow must eventually give way to water. Whatever the source of his conviction, Magellan returned to Portugal, determined to find backing for an expedition to discover the Western Passage. He sought an audience with King Manuel I, known as Manuel the Fortunate, because of the vast wealth that had flowed into Portugal during his reign. The king received him, listened to his proposal, and refused. The reasons for the refusal are unclear. Some sources say that Manuel disliked Magellan personally, perhaps because of some slight or offense during Magellan's eastern service. Others suggest that the king considered the scheme impractical, a waste of ships and men on a passage that probably did not exist. Still others hint at deeper political considerations. Manuel had no interest in proving that the Spice Islands lay within the Spanish sphere, and any successful western voyage would raise exactly that question. Magellan petitioned again and was again refused. He asked the king if he might offer his services to another sovereign, a formal request that Portuguese custom required before a nobleman could enter foreign service. The king, coldly, told him he was free to go wherever he wished. So Magellan went to Spain. He crossed the border sometime in 1517, accompanied by a small group of other disaffected Portuguese sailors and navigators who shared his dream of the Western Passage. Among them was Rui Falero, an astronomer and cosmographer who had developed methods for calculating longitude that he believed would prove the Moluccas lay in the Spanish hemisphere. Together, they sought out the Casa de Contratación in Seville, the royal house of trade that controlled all Spanish commerce with the Indies, and they presented their proposal to the officials there. The timing was fortunate. Spain had spent the quarter century since Columbus's first voyage establishing colonies in the Caribbean and exploring the coasts of the New World, but the great wealth of the East, the spices and silks that made Portuguese merchants rich, remained tantalizingly out of reach. The Spanish wanted a piece of the spice trade, and they were willing to back almost any scheme that promised to deliver it. The officials at the Casa de Contratación listened to Magellan and Falero, examined their charts and calculations, and passed the proposal up the chain of command to the young King Charles I, who had inherited the Spanish throne just the previous year. Charles was 18 years old, a Habsburg prince who had grown up in Flanders and spoke Spanish poorly, but he was intelligent, ambitious, and keenly aware of the commercial and political stakes involved in the spice trade. He received Magellan and Falero at Valladolid in March of 1518, examined their proposal in detail, and agreed to back the expedition. The terms were generous. Magellan and Falero would be appointed captains general of the fleet, with absolute authority over all personnel. They would receive 1/20 of the profits from any trade goods acquired, plus the governorship of any lands they discovered, plus noble titles and a coat of arms. In exchange, they would sail west, find the passage through or around the New World, reach the Spice Islands, and return with holds full of cloves and nutmeg and mace. The preparation of the fleet took more than a year. 5 ships were purchased and refitted in the shipyards of Seville: the Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the small Santiago. They were carracks, the standard ocean-going vessels of the period, with high castles at bow and stern, square-rigged on the foremast and mainmast, lateen-rigged on the mizzen. The largest, the San Antonio, displaced perhaps 120 tons, the smallest, the Santiago, perhaps 75. They were tiny by modern standards, smaller than many contemporary fishing boats, but they were sturdy, seaworthy, and capable of carrying the provisions and trade goods necessary for a voyage of unknown duration. The crew was recruited from the polyglot population of 16th century Seville, a city that had become the commercial capital of the Spanish Empire and a magnet for sailors, merchants, and adventurers from across Europe. The manifest lists Spaniards and Portuguese, Italians and Greeks, Frenchmen and Germans, Flemings and Africans. There were experienced sailors and green landsmen, skilled artisans and common laborers, priests and merchants, and men whose occupations are simply listed as servant or boy. There were criminals working off their sentences and gentlemen adventurers seeking glory. There was a Malay slave named Enrique, whom Magellan had acquired in Malacca years before, and who would serve as his interpreter in the eastern seas. There was a young Italian knight named Antonio Pigafetta, attached to the papal nuncio in Spain, who had heard about the expedition and begged permission to join simply for the experience. The fleet carried provisions for 2 years, biscuit and salt beef, wine and vinegar, oil and beans and rice. It carried trade goods to exchange for spices, bells and mirrors, knives and scissors, bolts of cloth in bright colors. It carried weapons to defend against attack, cannons and arquebuses and crossbows, swords and pikes and halberds. It carried tools for repair and navigation, spare sails and rigging, caulking materials, astrolabes and compasses and hourglasses. And it carried something else, something that would prove more important than all the rest. The knowledge, accumulated over a century of Portuguese exploration, of how to sail across oceans that no European had ever crossed. On the 20th of September, 1519, the fleet dropped down the Guadalquivir River from Seville to the harbor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, where the river meets the sea. Magellan took confession and made his will. The ships were blessed by the local bishop, and on the morning of the 20th, with the tide running out and a fair wind blowing from the northeast, the 5 small vessels set their sails and turned their prows toward the open Atlantic. They carried 270 men, more or less. Within 3 years, all but 18 of them would be dead. Ferdinand Magellan stood on the deck of the Trinidad as the Spanish coast fell away behind him. He was perhaps 39 years old. He had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment, and he had sacrificed everything, his nationality, his loyalty, his ties to the country of his birth, to make it happen. Ahead of him lay an ocean he had never crossed, a continent he had never seen, and a passage that might or might not exist. Behind him lay a crew that did not trust him, Spanish officers who resented serving under a Portuguese captain, and a king who expected miracles. The ships grew smaller against the gray Atlantic sky, until they were specks, until they were nothing at all. Somewhere far to the west, at the bottom of the world, a narrow strait of dark water wound through mountains of ice and stone. It had been there for millions of years, waiting. It would wait a little longer. The Atlantic crossing was uneventful, or as uneventful as any ocean passage could be in the 16th century. The fleet sailed southwest from the Canaries, following the route that Portuguese captains had pioneered in the decades after Columbus, riding the northeast trade winds down toward the equator and then catching the westerlies that would carry them across to the coast of Brazil. Magellan knew this route well. It was the same course he had followed when he first sailed east to India as a young man, the same winds and currents that Portuguese pilots had been charting for 3 generations. The ships made good time, covering perhaps 100 miles a day when the winds were favorable, less when they were not. The men settled into the grinding routine of shipboard life, 4-hour watches, salt beef and biscuit, the daily reckoning of position by dead reckoning and the noon sight of the sun. The officers began to chafe. The trouble had been there from the beginning, latent in the very structure of the expedition. Magellan was Portuguese. His principal officers were Spanish. The Spanish captains, Juan de Cartagena of the San Antonio, Gaspar de Quesada of the Concepcion, and Luis de Mendoza of the Victoria, were men of noble blood and considerable pride, and they had been appointed by the king to keep watch over this foreign adventurer who had somehow convinced the crown to back his scheme. They did not like taking orders from a Portuguese. They did not like being kept in ignorance of the expedition's course and destination. And they did not like the way Magellan ran his ships, with a discipline that struck them as harsh and a secrecy that struck them as insulting. The first confrontation came barely a week out from Spain. Juan de Cartagena, captain of the San Antonio and officially designated as Inspector General of the fleet, approached Magellan at the daily meeting of captains and demanded to know why the flagship had altered course without consulting the other ships. Magellan replied curtly that it was the captain's duty to follow his flag by day and his lantern by night, and that he would explain his orders when and if he chose. Cartagena pressed the point. Magellan cut him off. The exchange was witnessed by the other officers, and the slight was not forgotten. The tension simmered as the fleet crossed the Atlantic. Magellan continued to keep his own counsel, refusing to share his charts or explain his intentions. He was, by nature, a solitary and secretive man, and years of service under the Portuguese crown had taught him that knowledge shared was advantage lost. But his reticence bred suspicion. The Spanish officers began to meet privately, comparing grievances, testing each other's loyalty. They did not yet speak of mutiny, not openly, but the word hung in the air like the smell of rot in a ship's hold, faint but unmistakable. The fleet made landfall on the coast of Brazil in early December 1519, at a bay the Portuguese called Rio de Janeiro. Here they took on fresh water and provisions, trading with the Tupi people who inhabited the coastal forests. Pigafetta, the Italian chronicler, recorded the scene with the wide-eyed wonder of a man seeing the new world for the first time. The natives were friendly and curious, fascinated by the strange pale men and their floating houses. They traded freely, offering poultry and fish and the sweet potatoes that grew abundantly in their gardens in exchange for the bells and mirrors and bits of bright cloth that the sailors brought ashore. Some of the native women, Pigafetta noted with evident interest, were remarkably beautiful, and some of the sailors took advantage of the hospitality in ways that the chronicler described with more discretion than disapproval. The ships remained at Rio de Janeiro for 13 days, resting, reprovisioning, and repairing the damage of the Atlantic crossing. Then they turned south. The coast of South America trends southwest below the Tropic of Capricorn, a long curve of beaches and headlands and river mouths that the Portuguese had been exploring intermittently for 2 decades. Magellan followed this coast, sailing close inshore, examining every inlet and estuary for signs of the passage he believed must exist. He was looking for what the Portuguese called an estreito, a strait, a narrow channel of navigable water cutting through the continent from ocean to ocean. He had studied the Portuguese charts, incomplete and speculative as they were. He had spoken with pilots who had sailed these waters, and he carried, somewhere in his cabin, a globe made by the German cartographer Martin Behaim that showed a strait at approximately 40 degrees south latitude, a strait that may have been pure conjecture, or may have been based on rumors from indigenous peoples, or may have been the distorted echo of some actual Portuguese discovery that had been kept secret from the Spanish. We do not know. The sources do not tell us, and Magellan kept his own secrets. In January 1520, the fleet entered the vast estuary of the River Plate, where the Paraná and Uruguay rivers empty into the Atlantic. For days the water remained brackish, the banks far apart, and hope rose in Magellan's heart that this might be the passage. But the water grew steadily fresher as they sailed inland, and eventually there was no denying it. This was a river, not a strait, and it led nowhere but into the interior of a vast and unknown continent. The disappointment was bitter, but Magellan showed no outward sign of discouragement. He ordered the fleet to turn back to the coast and continue south. The season was turning. In the southern hemisphere, January is high summer, but as the fleet crept down the Patagonian coast through February and into March, the days grew shorter and the weather colder. The land they saw was bleak and barren, a windswept steppe of brown grass and stunted shrubs, empty of people as far as they could see. The sea grew rough, the winds unpredictable, the temperature dropping day by day. They were entering latitudes that no European had ever sailed, at least none who had returned to tell of it. The crew grew sullen and afraid. They had signed on for a voyage to the Spice Islands, not for a suicidal expedition into the frozen wilderness at the bottom of the world. On the last day of March 1520, with winter closing in and the coast offering no shelter from the mounting storms, Magellan made the decision to halt. He found a protected bay at a place he named Puerto San Julian at approximately 49 degrees south latitude, and he anchored the fleet there to wait out the winter. The men were informed that they would remain in this bleak harbor for 5 months on reduced rations until the southern spring made it possible to continue the search. The announcement was not well received. The mutiny broke on Easter Sunday, the 1st of April 1520. During the night, Gaspar de Quesada, captain of the Concepcion, went aboard the San Antonio with 30 armed men and arrested the ship's master, who was loyal to Magellan. Juan de Cartagena, who had been placed under arrest weeks earlier for his earlier confrontation with the captain general, was released and put in command of the San Antonio. Luis de Mendoza, captain of the Victoria, declared his ship for the mutineers. By dawn, 3 of the 5 ships were in rebel hands. Only the Trinidad, Magellan's flagship, and the Santiago remained loyal. The mutineers sent a boat to the Trinidad with a letter demanding that Magellan negotiate. Their terms were moderate, or so they claimed. They wanted only to be consulted, to be treated as partners in the enterprise, to have a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. They did not demand that Magellan surrender command, not yet. But the implicit threat was clear. They had the ships, they had the men, and if Magellan refused to deal, they would take the fleet back to Spain and leave him to rot on this frozen shore. What happened next reveals something essential about the character of Ferdinand Magellan. He did not negotiate, he did not bluster, he did not panic. He sent the boat back with a verbal message of conciliation, suggesting that he was prepared to discuss terms. And then he sent a small party of armed men, loyal sailors and soldiers, in another boat to the Victoria. They carried a letter for Luis de Mendoza, requesting his presence aboard the Trinidad for talks. When Mendoza bent to read the letter, one of Magellan's men stabbed him in the throat. The assault on the Victoria was swift and brutal. With Mendoza dead on the deck in a spreading pool of blood, his crew surrendered almost immediately. Magellan now had 3 ships against 2. That night, he moved the Trinidad, the Victoria, and the Santiago to block the harbor entrance so that the San Antonio and the Concepcion could not escape. When the tide turned and the San Antonio began to drift toward the blocking vessels, Magellan's men boarded her and overwhelmed the skeleton crew. By morning, the mutiny was over. It had lasted less than 48 hours. Magellan's justice was swift and carefully calibrated. Gaspar de Quesada, the ringleader, was tried, convicted, and beheaded. His body was drawn and quartered, and the pieces displayed on gibbets as a warning. Juan de Cartagena, who held a position of such importance that Magellan dared not execute him outright, was sentenced to marooning. He would be left behind when the fleet departed, along with a priest who had also participated in the conspiracy, to survive or die as fate decreed on that desolate shore. 40 men who had taken part in the mutiny were sentenced to death, but Magellan, calculating that he could not afford to lose so many sailors, commuted their sentences to hard labor. For the rest of the winter, they worked in chains, pumping bilges and hauling supplies, under the eyes of men who had remained loyal. The sources are silent on what became of Juan de Cartagena and the priest. No European would visit Puerto San Julian again for more than half a century, and when they did, they found no trace of the abandoned men. The Patagonian winter is long and dark. The land offers little food or shelter, and the indigenous peoples, if there were any in that region, might not have welcomed strangers. We can only presume that they died, alone and forgotten, on a shore that Magellan never looked back upon. The fleet remained at Puerto San Julian through the southern winter, April through August, while the storms howled outside the bay and the men huddled in their ships, cold, hungry, and afraid. In May, Magellan sent the Santiago south to scout the coast ahead. She was wrecked in a sudden storm, driven onto rocks and pounded to pieces by the waves. The crew survived, barely, and were rescued after an agonizing overland march back to the main fleet. But the expedition had lost one of its 5 ships, and they had not yet found the passage. In late August, with the austral spring approaching and the weather beginning to moderate, Magellan gave the order to sail. The 4 remaining ships weighed anchor and turned their prows once more to the south, creeping down a coast that grew ever more desolate, past headlands of black rock and beaches of gray sand, under skies that seemed perpetually threatening. The men were in poor spirits. They had spent 5 months in that frozen harbor. They had seen their officers killed and their comrades worked in chains, and they had no reason to believe that the strait Magellan sought actually existed. But they sailed because Magellan commanded it, and because there was nothing else they could do. On the 21st of October 1520, the feast day of St. Ursula and her 11,000 virgins, the lookout on the Trinidad sighted a cape that did not match anything on their charts. Beyond it, to the west, the coast fell away sharply, revealing what appeared to be a deep bay or inlet. Magellan ordered the San Antonio and the Concepcion to investigate, while the Trinidad and the Victoria waited offshore. What followed was 3 days of mounting anxiety. A fierce storm blew up, the worst they had yet encountered, and the 2 scouting vessels disappeared into the maelstrom. Magellan waited, watching the gray horizon, fearing the worst. And then, on the 3rd day, the San Antonio and the Concepcion came sailing back out of the inlet with their flags flying and their cannons firing in celebration. They had found the passage. The entrance was narrow, barely a mile wide, flanked by sheer cliffs of dark stone. The water was deep and cold, a strange milky green from the glacial runoff that poured into it from the mountains above. The tide ran through it with tremendous force, creating whirlpools and eddies that made the ships difficult to control. But it was navigable, and beyond the entrance, it opened into a wider channel that wound westward through a landscape unlike anything the Europeans had ever seen. Mountains rose on either side, white with snow and ice, their peaks hidden in the clouds. Glaciers spilled down from the heights, their blue faces calving icebergs into the water. The air was cold and still and smelled of nothing but salt and stone, and at night, on the southern shore, fires burned. Magellan named that land Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. He never learned who kindled those flames. We know now that they were the Yagan people, one of the indigenous groups who had inhabited these channels for thousands of years, living in a climate so harsh that European colonizers would later consider it uninhabitable. They traveled in bark canoes, hunted seals and gathered shellfish, and kept fires burning constantly, even in their boats, because fire was life in a world where the wind never stopped and the temperature rarely rose above freezing. Magellan saw their fires from across the water and noted them in his log, but he made no attempt to contact them. He was a man in a hurry, and he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. The passage through the strait took 38 days, 38 days of threading through a labyrinth of channels and dead ends, of battling willowaw winds that could capsize a ship without warning, of sounding the depths and watching for rocks and praying that each turn would reveal the open ocean beyond. The strait was not a simple channel, but a complex network of waterways, some leading west toward the Pacific, others curving south into the maze of islands that stretched toward Antarctica. Magellan sent boats ahead to scout each branch, waiting anxiously for their return, making decision after decision in the near darkness of the southern spring. The days were long. This close to the solstice, the sun barely set, but the light was gray and flat, and the mountains seemed to close in from every side. During the passage, the San Antonio deserted. The largest ship in the fleet, carrying the bulk of the expedition's remaining provisions, she slipped away one night while scouting a side channel and turned back toward the Atlantic. Her pilot, Estevão Gomes, a Portuguese who had never reconciled himself to serving under Magellan, had seized control of the ship and convinced or coerced the crew to abandon the expedition. They sailed back through the strait, back to Puerto San Julian to retrieve what was left of the supplies cached there, and then across the Atlantic to Spain, where they arrived in May 1521, and told the king that Magellan had gone mad, that the passage was impassable, that the entire enterprise was doomed. By the time their story reached the court, Magellan was already dead. But Magellan did not know that, could not have known it, as he watched the San Antonio fail to return from her scouting mission and slowly realized that she had abandoned him. He sent the Victoria back through the strait to search for her, but she was gone. The provisions were gone. The largest ship, the one most capable of carrying the spices that were supposed to justify the entire voyage, was gone. Magellan was left with 3 small vessels and perhaps 150 men, facing an ocean of unknown size with supplies calculated for a crew twice that number. He held a council. The officers, those who remained loyal, recommended turning back. The sensible thing to do, the thing any rational commander would do, was to return to Spain, refit, and try again with adequate supplies. The strait had been found. The knowledge would not be lost. There was no dishonor in admitting that the provisions were insufficient for what lay ahead. Magellan refused. Pigafetta recorded that the Captain General declared he would sail on, even if they had to eat the leather wrappings on the yards. He would find the Spice Islands, or he would die in the attempt. He had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. He had renounced his country, defied his king, crossed an ocean, put down a mutiny, and lost a ship to find this passage. He was not going to turn back now. On the 28th of November 1520, the 3 remaining vessels emerged from the western mouth of the strait into the open Pacific. Magellan, standing on the deck of the Trinidad, looked out at an expanse of water that seemed to stretch forever, calm and blue and impossibly vast. After all the storms and the ice and the treacherous channels, after all the death and betrayal and fear, the sea before him was quiet. He wept, according to Pigafetta, and he gave this ocean the name by which we still know it today. He called it the Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. It was not peaceful. It was only very, very large. The Pacific Ocean covers more than 60 million square miles, roughly 1/3 of the Earth's surface, larger than all the land on the planet combined. Magellan knew none of this. His charts, such as they were, showed a relatively narrow sea between the American coast and the Asian islands, perhaps a few weeks' sail at most. The globe he had studied, Baham's globe, was wrong by a factor of 10. No European had ever crossed this ocean. No European had ever even seen it, except from the summit of a mountain in Panama, where Vasco Núñez de Balboa had first glimpsed its waters 7 years earlier. Magellan was sailing into a void. The 3 ships set course northwest, riding the trade winds that would carry them toward the equator and eventually toward Asia. Day after day, the sea stretched unbroken to the horizon. Day after day, the lookouts climbed the masts and scanned the blue emptiness and saw nothing. Day after day, the sun rose and the sun set, and the ships crept forward across an ocean that seemed to have no end. The men began to wonder if they had sailed off the edge of the world. The rations, already short, were cut and cut again. Each man received a daily portion of biscuit so riddled with weevils that it was more pest than food, eaten in the dark so the sailors wouldn't have to see what they were swallowing. The water in the casks turned green, and then brown, and then so foul that men had to hold their noses to drink it. When the biscuit ran out, they ate the sawdust that accumulated in the bottom of the bread lockers, mixed with whatever rats they could catch. When the rats grew scarce, they began to eat the leather, the chafing gear that protected the rigging from wear, soaked in seawater for 4 or 5 days, until it was soft enough to chew, and then grilled over the cooking fires. It tasted, Pigafetta reported, like nothing he could describe, but they ate it anyway, because there was nothing else. And then the scurvy came. The disease appeared slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, a strange lethargy that crept over the crew, a tendency for small cuts to refuse to heal. Then the gums began to swell, growing spongy and purple and so sensitive that eating became an agony. Teeth loosened and fell out. Old wounds that had healed years before broke open and began to bleed. Joints swelled and stiffened until men could barely move. Some went blind. Some went mad. And then they began to die. 19 men died during the Pacific crossing, according to Pigafetta. He does not record their names. They were buried at sea, sewn into their hammocks with a cannonball at their feet, and tipped over the side into water so deep and so blue that they seemed to fall forever before they disappeared. The ships sailed on, their crews dwindling, their supplies exhausted, their hope fading. Magellan held his course. On the 6th of March 1521, after 98 days without sight of land, 98 days of starvation and disease and the slow creeping terror of the infinite, the lookout on the Trinidad cried out, "Land." They saw it first as a smudge on the horizon, a darkening of the sky that might have been cloud or might have been the thing they had prayed for through all those endless weeks of dying. The ships altered course. The men who could still walk came up on deck, leaning on each other, shading their eyes against the Pacific glare. And as the hours passed and the smudge resolved itself into the unmistakable shapes of land, green peaks rising from the sea, palm trees bending in the wind, the white line of surf breaking on a reef, something close to delirium seized the fleet. Men who had lain in their hammocks for weeks, too weak to move, somehow found the strength to climb the rigging. Others fell to their knees on the salt-crusted deck and wept. Pigafetta himself, weakened but still writing, recorded the scene with the precision of a man who understood that he was witnessing something that would never happen again. The islands were small, little more than coral atolls fringed with vegetation, but they held what the fleet needed most desperately: fresh water, coconuts, and fish. The ships anchored in a protected lagoon, and the men went ashore in boats, staggering through the shallows like men risen from their graves. They drank from the freshwater springs until their bellies ached. They cracked open coconuts and let the sweet milk run down their chins. They lay in the shade of the palm trees and breathed air that didn't smell of rot and death and the close confinement of ships that had become floating charnel houses. But the encounter was not to be peaceful. The islanders, who had never seen Europeans before, were fascinated by the ships and by the strange pale men who had emerged from them. They were also, in the manner of people throughout the Pacific, skilled and enthusiastic traders, which is to say, by European standards, they were thieves. They swarmed aboard the ships while the exhausted crews slept, carrying off everything they could move: rope, canvas, tools, weapons, the small boat that hung from the stern of the Trinidad. Magellan, furious at the violation and desperate to recover the stolen skiff, which was essential for ferrying men and supplies to shore, ordered a punitive raid. 40 armed men went ashore, burned perhaps 40 or 50 houses, killed 7 or 8 islanders, and recovered the boat. The violence was swift and disproportionate, as European violence in the Pacific would remain for the next 3 centuries. Magellan, who had shown patience and restraint through mutiny and starvation and the endless terrors of the strait, had no patience for what he saw as treachery. He named these islands the Ladrones, the Islands of Thieves, and sailed away with his holds restocked and his conscience apparently clear. The name would stick for 200 years until a later generation of Spanish missionaries, perhaps embarrassed by its implications, renamed them the Marianas in honor of Queen Mariana of Austria. The fleet rested at the Ladrones for only 3 days. The men were still weak, still dying of scurvy despite the fresh food. The disease had progressed too far in many of them to be reversed. But Magellan was impatient to press on. He knew now that he was close. The currents, the winds, the very temperature of the water told him that he was approaching the great archipelagos of the East. 10 more days of sailing brought them to a cluster of islands far larger and more populous than anything they had yet seen. They had reached the Philippines. The Philippines of 1521 were not a nation. The concept of the Philippines as a unified political entity would not exist for another 50 years, until the Spanish conquest that Magellan's voyage made possible. What Magellan found instead was a constellation of islands inhabited by peoples who spoke dozens of different languages, practiced a variety of religions. Islam was spreading northward from the great trading sultanates of Borneo and Mindanao, while older animist traditions still dominated the central islands and organized themselves into small, independent polities called barangays, each ruled by a chieftain or datu. These were not primitive peoples. They were sophisticated traders who had been part of the vast commercial networks of maritime Southeast Asia for centuries. They knew about China, about India, about the Spice Islands to the south. They had never heard of Europe. Magellan anchored first at the small island of Homenhon, where the fleet rested for 8 days and where the sick were finally given time and fresh food enough to begin recovering. Here, something remarkable happened. Magellan's slave, a man named Enrique, who had been captured or purchased in Malacca years earlier during Magellan's service in the East, spoke to the islanders in Malay, and they understood him. Or rather, some of them did, those who had traded with the great emporium of Malacca and learned the language of commerce that linked the islands of Southeast Asia together. The implication was staggering. Magellan had sailed so far west that he had reached the east. The world had closed. Enrique deserves more attention than history has given him. He appears in the records as Magellan's slave, a piece of property mentioned in wills and inventories, but his role in the expedition was far more significant than that legal status suggests. He was Magellan's interpreter, his intermediary with the peoples of the East, the voice through which the Captain General negotiated and threatened and converted. If the criterion for completing the first circumnavigation is being the first person to travel completely around the globe and return to one's starting point, then Enrique, not Magellan, not Elcano, not any of the 18 European survivors, may hold that honor. He had been born somewhere in the islands of Southeast Asia. Malacca, Sumatra, perhaps the Philippines themselves, had been taken west to Portugal, had sailed west again with Magellan across the Atlantic and the Pacific, and had now returned to waters where his native language was spoken. The circuit was complete, but Enrique was a slave, and slaves do not feature in the heroic narratives of European exploration. His name survives only because Pigafetta thought him worth mentioning. From Homenhon, the fleet sailed westward through the archipelago, island hopping through the Visayan Sea, trading with the local chieftains, replenishing their supplies, and slowly gathering information about the geography and politics of this new world. Magellan was cautious at first, careful to establish peaceful relations, willing to exchange gifts and participate in the elaborate ceremonies of friendship that the island cultures required. He was looking for allies, for trading partners, for a foothold that would allow the expedition to achieve its commercial goals. He was also increasingly looking for converts. The religious dimension of Magellan's final weeks has puzzled historians. The man who had spent 2 years navigating his fleet through every conceivable danger, who had suppressed mutiny with execution and abandonment, who had held his starving crews together through 98 days of oceanic purgatory, suddenly began to behave less like a naval commander than like a missionary. He ordered his chaplain to conduct masses on shore. He presented crucifixes and images of the Virgin to the island chieftains. He spoke passionately about the Christian God and the salvation of souls. When the ruler of the island of Cebu, a Datu named Humabon, expressed interest in the newcomer's religion, Magellan threw himself into the work of conversion with an intensity that alarmed even his own officers. The baptism of Humabon and his family on April 14, 1509, was the high point of Magellan's Philippine adventure. The ceremony was elaborate, calculated to impress. Pigafetta describes a pavilion erected on the shore, draped with cloth and palm branches, with a platform raised at one end to serve as an altar. Magellan himself led the rituals, presenting Humabon with a chair draped in red velvet, the symbolic seat of Christian kingship, and an image of the Christ child, which became known as the Santo Niño de Cebu, and remains to this day the most venerated religious icon in the Philippines. Humabon was baptized with the Christian name Charles in honor of the Spanish king. His principal wife became Juana after the king's mother. In the days that followed, according to Pigafetta, some 800 islanders accepted baptism, including most of the local nobility. What was Magellan thinking? The question matters because the answer leads directly to his death. Some historians have seen his religious fervor as a genuine spiritual conversion, a man who had faced the abyss of the Pacific and emerged with his faith intensified. Others have interpreted it more cynically as a political strategy designed to bind the local rulers to Spain through religious allegiance and thereby secure exclusive trading rights for the expedition's backers. Still others have suggested that Magellan, exhausted by 2 years of leadership, starved and weakened like his men, may simply have lost his judgment. The obsession that had driven him to this point, the absolute certainty that the Western Passage existed, that he could find it, that he could succeed where others had failed, may have curdled into something more dangerous, a conviction that he was not merely an explorer, but an instrument of divine will. Whatever his reasoning, Magellan's behavior in the days after Humabon's conversion became increasingly erratic. He demanded that all the chiefs of the neighboring islands submit to Humabon's authority, and, through Humabon, to Spain and to God. He threatened those who refused with the destruction of their villages. He He seems to have believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that the power of European arms was so overwhelming that resistance was impossible. When the chief of the small island of Mactan, a man named Lapu-Lapu, refused to acknowledge Humabon's overlordship and sent back a defiant message, Magellan decided to make an example of him. The decision was insane by any rational military calculus. Mactan was not a strategic objective. Its chief posed no threat to the fleet. The expedition's mission was commercial exploration, not conquest. Magellan's officers argued against the attack. Humabon himself, who understood local politics far better than his new Christian ally, counseled patience and diplomacy. But Magellan would not be dissuaded. He announced that he would lead the assault personally with a small force of Europeans, and that he would demonstrate to all the islands of the archipelago the irresistible power of Christian arms. On the night of April 26, 1521, the expedition's boats rowed toward Mactan in darkness. Magellan had assembled perhaps 60 men, though he would take only 49 ashore with him. He intended to leave the rest as a reserve in the boats, or perhaps he simply didn't have enough armor to outfit more. They reached the island in the last hours before dawn and waited for first light to begin their attack. The plan was simple: a show of force, a bombardment from the ships, a demonstration of European firepower that would scatter the natives and send Lapu-Lapu fleeing into the jungle. Magellan expected a quick victory. He expected awe. What he got was a reef. The coral shelf surrounding Mactan extended far out from shore, and when dawn broke and Magellan ordered the fleet's cannon to open fire, the ships could not approach close enough for their guns to reach the beach. The Spanish artillery, which had terrified every enemy they had faced from Africa to South America, boomed and roared and sent their iron balls splashing harmlessly into the shallows hundreds of yards from the massed warriors on the shore. Lapu-Lapu had chosen his ground well. He had assembled perhaps 1,500 men, Pigafetta's estimate, possibly exaggerated but certainly indicating a force vastly larger than Magellan's, and he had positioned them precisely where the European advantages of gunpowder and steel would be neutralized. Magellan waded ashore anyway. The water was waist-deep over the reef, and the distance from the boats to the beach was perhaps 2 or 3 crossbow shots, several hundred yards of wading through warm, crystal-clear water, while arrows and spears and stones rained down from the island. The Spanish crossbows and arquebuses, deadly at close range, were almost useless at this distance, and the men were too encumbered by their armor to reload quickly while standing in the sea. They struggled forward. Some fell, others turned back. Magellan, recognizable by the quality of his armor and his position at the head of the attack, became the focus of every weapon on the beach. They reached the shallows near the shore, and there the warriors of Mactan met them. The fighting was close and desperate and utterly one-sided. The Spanish armor, which should have been their great advantage, became a liability. It was heavy, it restricted movement, and the islanders quickly learned to aim for the legs, which were unprotected below the knee. Magellan was struck by a bamboo spear in the leg and went down. He struggled to rise. He was struck again, in the arm, in the face. His helmet was knocked off. He tried to draw his sword, but his arm wouldn't obey. Pigafetta, who was there, who was wounded himself, watched as a warrior drove an iron-tipped lance through Magellan's unprotected face. He fell forward into the water. His men, those who could still move, fled for the boats. They left his body where it lay. The aftermath was chaos. The Spanish survivors rowed back to the ships in disarray, carrying their wounded, abandoning their dead. They had lost perhaps 8 men, including Magellan, a small number in absolute terms but catastrophic when measured against what the expedition could afford to lose. More importantly, they had lost their leader, the man whose will and vision had held the voyage together through every crisis of the past 2 years. And they had lost something else, the myth of European invincibility. The chieftains who had submitted to Humabon, who had accepted baptism and professed allegiance to the distant Spanish king, had watched the great Captain General wade ashore with all his guns and armor, and they had watched the people of Mactan kill him anyway. The political consequences were immediate. Humabon, who had calculated that alliance with the Europeans would strengthen his position against his rivals, now recalculated. The Spanish were not invincible. They could be killed, and there were so few of them, and they were so far from home, and the holds of their ships were full of goods that would fetch high prices in the markets of the East. Within days of Magellan's death, Humabon invited the expedition's new leaders. They had chosen two replacements, the captain Duarte Barbosa and the navigator João Serrão, to a farewell banquet on shore. It was a trap. When the Spanish officers came ashore, unarmed and unsuspecting, Humabon's men fell on them. Barbosa and Serrão were killed, along with perhaps 24 others. Serrão was dragged to the water's edge, still alive, and his shipmates in the boats were forced to watch as he begged them to ransom him, to trade goods for his life. The new commanders, terrified and overwhelmed, refused. They rowed away and left him to die. The ships weighed anchor and fled. Only one man who might have prevented the disaster was absent from the banquet. Enrique, Magellan's slave, had been wounded at Mactan and had retreated to his hammock in the days that followed, refusing to work, refusing to translate, refusing to participate in the expedition's increasingly desperate deliberations. The new commanders had threatened him, had told him that he was still a slave and would be sold in the markets of India when they reached the East. It is possible, some historians have argued, that Enrique, realizing he was now in waters where his language was spoken, had decided that his loyalty to Magellan did not extend to Magellan's successors. It is possible that he warned Humabon of the Spanish plans, or encouraged the ambush, or simply stood aside and let events take their course. We do not know. The sources are silent. Enrique disappears from the historical record after the massacre at Cebu, presumably remaining in the islands, perhaps returning at last to the home from which he had been taken so many years before. If so, he completed his circumnavigation of the globe long before any European. But slaves do not leave memoirs, and his story ends in silence. The survivors of Cebu numbered barely enough men to crew 2 ships. The Concepcion, her hull rotting and her timbers sprung, was stripped of everything useful and burned in a quiet bay. The Trinidad and the Victoria sailed on, wandering through the islands of the southern Philippines and the coast of Borneo, trading where they could, fighting when they had to, searching for the spice islands that Magellan had promised lay just over the horizon. They had no clear leader. They had no coherent plan. They had only the inertia of the voyage itself, the knowledge that they could not go back, that the only way home was forward, through the unknown, toward the lands of cinnamon and clove. It took them 6 months. They reached the Moluccas in November of 1521, dropping anchor at last in the waters off the tiny volcanic island of Tidore. The Sultan of Tidore, locked in a struggle with the neighboring Sultan of Ternate, saw the strangers as potential allies and welcomed them enthusiastically. For the first time since leaving Spain more than 2 years earlier, the expedition achieved its commercial objective. They loaded their ships with cloves, the small, dark, intensely aromatic flower buds that were worth more than their weight in gold on the markets of Europe. The holds of the Trinidad and the Victoria filled with the smell of spice, the smell of wealth, the smell of everything Magellan had promised and died trying to reach. But the ships were dying too. The long Pacific crossing, the months of wandering through Philippine waters, the rot and the teredo worms and the accumulated damage of 2 years at sea had taken their toll. When the crews inspected the Trinidad's hull, they found her leaking badly, taking on water faster than the pumps could clear it. She would have to be repaired before she could attempt the long voyage home. The Victoria, somewhat less damaged, might make it. A decision was made. The Victoria would sail west immediately, carrying as much of the cargo as she could hold, attempting the dangerous passage around the Cape of Good Hope and back to Spain. The Trinidad would remain at Tidore for repairs and then attempt to sail east, back across the Pacific to the Spanish colonies in the Americas. On December 21st, 1521, the Victoria weighed anchor and set her course for home. Her captain was Juan Sebastian Elcano, a Basque navigator who had been among the mutineers at San Julian 2 winters earlier. Magellan had spared his life, sentencing him to hard labor instead of execution, and the man who had once plotted against the Captain General would now complete the voyage the Captain General had begun. The Victoria carried 60 men and a hold full of cloves. She had perhaps 8 months of sailing ahead of her, through pirate-infested waters, around the tip of Africa, up the long Atlantic coast, and home. She had no guarantee of success. The Portuguese, whose monopoly on the spice trade the expedition threatened, had ships in these waters. The ocean had ships of its own, storms, doldrums, the endless blue emptiness that had nearly killed them all on the Pacific crossing. Elcano knew, as he watched Tidor fade into the haze behind him, that he might never see Spain again. The Trinidad never made it. She was repaired well enough to sail, and in April of 1522 she set out to cross the Pacific, intending to reach the western coast of the Americas and make her way from there to a Spanish port. But the voyage was a disaster from the beginning. The winds that had carried Magellan west across the ocean refused to carry the Trinidad east. She beat against contrary headwinds for months, her crew dying of scurvy and starvation, her timbers working loose in the heavy seas, until at last her captain gave up and limped back to the Moluccas. There she was captured by a Portuguese squadron that had been sent to assert Portugal's claim to the Spice Islands. Her surviving crew were imprisoned, her cargo confiscated, her hull stripped and abandoned to rot on a tropical beach. Of the men who had remained with her, only 4 would eventually find their way back to Spain years later by circuitous routes. The rest died in Portuguese prisons or were lost in the islands or simply disappeared into the anonymous mass of European flotsam that drifted through the ports of the East in those years. The Victoria, meanwhile, was fighting her way home. The voyage that lay ahead of Elcano and his 60 men was perhaps the most dangerous passage any European vessel had ever attempted. They were sailing through waters that belonged, by papal decree and by force of arms, to the Portuguese crown. Every port from the Moluccas to the Cape Verde Islands flew the flag of their enemy. Every harbor master, every coastal fortress, every patrol ship they might encounter would be hostile. If they stopped for supplies, they risked capture, imprisonment, the confiscation of their cargo, and quite possibly execution as pirates and trespassers. If they did not stop, they risked starvation, thirst, and the slow death of scurvy that had already claimed so many of their companions. Elcano chose to run. The Victoria slipped through the Indonesian archipelago like a shadow, sailing at night when possible, keeping to channels away from the main shipping routes, speaking to no one. She passed through the Banda Sea and into the waters north of Timor, where the Portuguese had not yet established firm control. She crossed the Indian Ocean in the worst season, fighting against the monsoon winds that blew hard from the southwest, the same winds that would have carried her swiftly if only she had been traveling in the opposite direction. The crossing took months instead of weeks. The ship's already damaged timbers groaned and worked in the heavy swells. The caulking loosened in the seams and water seeped into the hold, wetting the precious cargo of cloves, mixing the smell of spice with the smell of rot and bilge water. The men began to die again. Scurvy returned, as it always did on long voyages without fresh provisions. Their gums turned black and swelled until eating became impossible. Old wounds reopened as the connective tissue that held their bodies together began to dissolve. They grew weak, then weaker, lying in their hammocks unable to work the ship, listening to the creak of the rigging and the slap of water against the hull, waiting to see whether death or landfall would come first. Pigafetta, who was aboard and who somehow survived everything, recorded these deaths in his journal with the same meticulous attention he had given to the customs of the Patagonians and the wildlife of the Pacific Islands. Name after name, date after date, body after body slipped over the side into the warm Indian Ocean. They rounded the Cape of Good Hope in early May of 1522, more than 4 months after leaving Tidore. The cape that Portuguese sailors called the Cape of Storms lived up to its name. Heavy seas battered the Victoria, and the winds that should have pushed her north into the Atlantic instead pushed her back again and again, until Elcano began to fear that the ship would simply come apart beneath him. They had no charts for these waters. They had no pilot who had made this passage before. They were navigating by dead reckoning and desperation, trying to find their way around a continent they had never seen, in a ship that was falling to pieces around them. When they finally cleared the Cape and turned north along the African coast, they faced a new decision. The ship was leaking badly. Their supplies were nearly exhausted. Many of the crew were too sick to work. If they continued straight to Spain without stopping, they might all die before they reached home. But if they stopped at any Portuguese port, they would certainly be captured. There was one possibility, a slender hope. The Cape Verde Islands, a Portuguese possession off the coast of West Africa, where they might be able to buy provisions and perhaps repair the ship, if they could somehow conceal their identity and the nature of their cargo. They arrived at the Cape Verde Islands in early July, worn down to the bone, the Victoria riding low in the water, her sails patched and repatched, her rigging held together with improvised repairs. Elcano concocted a cover story. They were a Spanish ship returning from the Americas, he told the port authorities. They had been blown off course by storms. They needed food, water, and rice to patch their hull. The Portuguese officials were suspicious but not immediately hostile. They allowed a boat to go ashore for provisions. The deception lasted for 2 days. The men sent ashore to buy rice made a fatal mistake. They tried to pay with cloves. In a world where information about distant events traveled slowly, where even educated Europeans might not know what was happening on the other side of their own continent, the appearance of a shipload of bedraggled Spanish sailors carrying spices from the Moluccas was enough to raise questions. The Portuguese authorities detained 13 of the men. They began to ask pointed questions about where this ship had come from and what it was doing in Portuguese waters. Elcano did not wait to find out how those questions would be answered. The moment he learned that his men had been detained, he cut his anchor cable and fled. He left 13 of his surviving crew behind on the Cape Verde Islands, prisoners of the Portuguese, and sailed with what remained, 18 men in all, 18 men to work a ship that properly required a crew of 40. They sailed north through the Atlantic summer, short-handed and exhausted, surviving on what little food they had managed to buy before the alarm was raised. The African coast fell away behind them. The familiar stars of the northern hemisphere rose slowly over the horizon. The Portuguese patrol ships that might have caught them never appeared. And on September 6, 1522, 3 years almost to the day since she had departed, the Victoria limped into the harbor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda on the southwestern coast of Spain. The men who came ashore that day were barely recognizable as human. They were skeletal, their skins stretched tight over bones that protruded at every joint. They were bearded, filthy, dressed in rags that had once been the uniforms of His Majesty's naval service. They walked slowly, carefully, like men who had forgotten how to trust solid ground beneath their feet. They had sailed around the entire world. They had crossed oceans that no European had ever crossed. They had seen lands that existed only as rumors and legends on the maps of their time. And they had come home carrying 53,000 pounds of cloves in their hold, enough spice to pay for the entire expedition several times over, enough to make fortunes for the investors who had backed Magellan's dream. But they had also left behind them a trail of death that stretched from the frozen shores of Patagonia to the tropical waters of the Philippines. Of the 270 men who had sailed from this same harbor 3 years earlier, only 18 had returned aboard the Victoria. Another dozen or so would eventually make their way home by other routes, the 4 survivors from the Trinidad, the 13 captured at Cape Verde, who were eventually released after diplomatic pressure from Spain. The rest, more than 200 men, were dead. They had died of scurvy and starvation. They had died in battles with natives and with each other. They had drowned when their ships sank or wrecked on unknown reefs. They had died of disease in the pestilential harbors of the Spice Islands. They had been killed, like Magellan himself, in places whose names they could not pronounce, fighting in quarrels they barely understood, far from anyone who loved them or would ever know exactly how they died. This was the true cost of the first circumnavigation. Not the 18 men who stumbled ashore at Sanlúcar, but the 250 who did not. Not the ship that completed the voyage, but the 4 ships that were lost, the Santiago wrecked in Patagonia, the San Antonio that deserted and returned to Spain, the Concepcion burned in the Philippines, the Trinidad rotting on a beach in the Moluccas. The voyage that proved the earth was round was paid for in human suffering on a scale that is difficult to comprehend from a distance of 5 centuries. And yet the knowledge they brought back was beyond price. Before Magellan's expedition, educated Europeans understood in theory that the Earth was a sphere. The ancient Greeks had known this, Columbus had known it, but no one had ever demonstrated it empirically, had ever proven it by the simple expedient of sailing west until you arrived back where you started. No one had understood, truly understood, how large that sphere was. The Pacific Ocean alone was bigger than all the land on Earth combined. The distance from Spain to the Spice Islands sailing west was more than twice what Magellan and his cosmographers had calculated. The Earth was not a small, knowable world with Asia just over the western horizon. It was an immense planet, mostly covered by water, with vast distances between the scattered fragments of land where human beings made their homes. The Victoria's voyage demonstrated this truth in a way that no theoretical argument ever could. It showed that the oceans were connected, that a ship could sail from any port in the world to any other port if it had the supplies and the courage to make the passage. It showed that the Portuguese route to the east around the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean was not the only route, that the world could be approached from both directions, that the monopoly Portugal claimed over the spice trade was based on a geographical accident, not an inescapable necessity. It showed, most fundamentally, that the world was one world, that every part of it was accessible to every other part, that humanity was not divided into separate civilizations by uncrossable barriers of ocean and ice, but connected, for better and for worse, in a single global community of trade and contact and eventual conflict. The men aboard the Victoria made another discovery, one so strange that it seemed at first to be impossible. When they arrived at the Cape Verde Islands, they believed it was Wednesday, July 9th, 1522. They had kept careful track of the days throughout their voyage, noting each sunrise, counting each rotation of the earth as it passed beneath their keel. But the Portuguese at Cape Verde insisted it was Thursday, July 10th. The Victoria had lost a day somewhere on its voyage around the world. This was not an error in calculation. This was physics. By sailing westward around the Earth, following the sun, the crew of the Victoria had experienced one fewer sunset than the people who had stayed home in Spain. They had lived through one fewer day. The phenomenon would later be explained by the establishment of the International Date Line, the imaginary line in the Pacific, where the calendar advances by one day for travelers crossing from west to east. But for the men of the Victoria, who knew nothing of time zones or date lines, it was simply bewildering. They had lost a day of their lives, had it taken from them by the simple fact of their motion through space, and they would never get it back. Pigafetta found this discovery almost more remarkable than the voyage itself. He devoted considerable space in his journal to the puzzle, consulting with learned men after his return, trying to understand how such a thing could be. The answer was straightforward enough. The Earth rotates, and if you travel around it in the same direction as its rotation, you circle the sun once fewer times than someone who stays still. But the fact that the answer was straightforward did not make the phenomenon any less strange. The Victoria had sailed not only around the world, but, in some sense, slightly out of time. Its crew had experienced the universe in a way no human beings had ever experienced it before. King Charles received the survivors with honor. Elcano was granted a coat of arms featuring a globe with the motto Primus circumdedisти me, you were the first to circumnavigate me. The investors received their share of the clove profits. The surviving crew were paid their wages, though many had to sue for years to collect what they were owed. The 13 men left behind at Cape Verde were eventually released after Spain lodged formal protests through diplomatic channels. The story of the voyage spread through Europe with remarkable speed, carried by Pigafetta's journal and by the testimony of the survivors, read and discussed and debated in every court and university where men gathered to talk about the shape of the world. Magellan's reputation, however, remained contested. In Spain, where he had died as a servant of the Spanish crown, he was celebrated as a hero, the man who had found the western passage to the Indies and proved that it could be done. But in his native Portugal, he was remembered as a traitor, a man who had renounced his country and his king to serve a foreign power, who had helped Spain break the Portuguese monopoly on the eastern trade. Portuguese historians minimized his achievements or attributed the voyage's success to Elcano and the Spanish officers who had completed what the Portuguese deserter had begun. The question of who deserved credit for the first circumnavigation, the man who conceived and commanded the voyage, or the man who brought the ship home, became a point of national rivalry that would persist for centuries. The passage through the strait that Magellan had discovered proved, in practice, to be nearly useless. The 38-day struggle through those cold and treacherous waters, the willowaw winds, the dead ends and false channels, the sheer distance from any source of supply, all of this made the western route to the Spice Islands far more dangerous and expensive than the Portuguese route around Africa. Spain would send a few more expeditions through the strait in the decades following the Victoria's return, but none of them achieved commercial success. The real beneficiary of Magellan's voyage was not the spice trade, but the colony that would eventually grow up on the other side of the Pacific, in the islands Magellan had named for St. Lazarus, and that Spain would rename for King Philip. The Philippines would become Spain's gateway to Asia, not through the strait that Magellan had found, but through overland routes across Mexico, the famous Manila galleons that would carry Chinese silk and porcelain to Acapulco in exchange for American silver. Magellan had opened a door, but the traffic that flowed through it followed paths he had never imagined. The man himself remains strangely difficult to know. Pigafetta's journal, for all its detail about the voyage, tells us surprisingly little about its commander as a person. We learn that he was devout, hearing Mass daily when circumstances permitted. We learn that he was brave, fighting at the front in every battle, refusing to flee when flight might have saved his life. We learn that he was stubborn, pressing on through the Pacific when any reasonable commander would have turned back, insisting on his fatal expedition to Mactan despite the advice of his officers. We learn that he inspired loyalty in some men and bitter hatred in others, that his Spanish captains tried to kill him and his Portuguese servants tried to save him, that he was capable of great cruelty toward mutineers and great tenderness toward the native peoples he encountered when they did not resist him. But of his inner life, his private thoughts, his doubts and fears and hopes, we know almost nothing. He left no memoirs, no letters that have survived, no testimony of any kind in his own voice. Everything we know about him comes from others, from Pigafetta, who admired him, from the Spanish officials who needed to justify the voyage's costs, from the Portuguese historians who needed to condemn his treason. The real Magellan, the man who existed inside that armor and behind those hard eyes that stared west across unknown oceans, has been lost. He is a silhouette, a shape, a set of actions that can be narrated but not fully explained. What we can say is that he was a man who believed in something with an intensity that most people never experience. He believed that the world could be crossed, that the Western Passage existed, that he was the one who could find it. He held on to that belief through years of rejection in Portugal, through the humiliations of the Spanish court, through mutiny and starvation and the endless blue emptiness of the Pacific. He held on to it until the moment he died, face down in the shallow water of a Philippine beach, surrounded by enemies, still trying to reach the Spice Islands he could almost smell on the wind. Whether this was courage or madness, vision or obsession, is a question the historical record cannot answer. Perhaps it was all of these things at once. The expedition he created would have consequences he could not have foreseen. Within a generation of the Victoria's return, European ships would be sailing regularly across both great oceans, establishing trading posts and colonies on every inhabited continent, weaving the world together into a single system of commerce and competition and exploitation that would shape the next 5 centuries of human history. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and peoples between the Old World and the New, would accelerate and intensify. The great empires of Asia would be drawn into contact with European powers that had previously seemed too distant to matter. The peoples of the Pacific, who had lived for thousands of years in relative isolation, would find themselves suddenly visible to eyes from the other side of the world, suddenly vulnerable to ships and guns and diseases against which they had no defense. Magellan did not cause all of this. The forces that drove European expansion in the 16th century, the search for profit, the competition between rival powers, the missionary zeal that accompanied colonization, the simple human hunger to know what lay beyond the horizon, would have operated with or without him. Someone else would have found the strait eventually. Someone else would have crossed the Pacific. The world was going to become one world whether Magellan lived or died. But he was the one who went first. He was the one who stood at the entrance to the strait that now bears his name in the cold southern spring of 1520 and chose to press on into the unknown. He was the one who named the Pacific, who held his fleet together through 98 days of empty ocean, who died trying to establish Spanish power over peoples who had no desire to be ruled by Spain. His choices shaped the particular way the connection was made, the particular places where Europe touched Asia and changed it forever. The world he helped create bears his fingerprints, even if the shape of that world was not what he intended. On the island of Mactan, where he fell, there stands today a curious monument. It was erected in the early 20th century, during the American colonial period in the Philippines, and it commemorates both Magellan and Lapu-Lapu, the explorer and the chieftain who killed him. The monument's inscription praises Magellan for his courage and Lapu-Lapu for his resistance, holding the two men together in a kind of moral balance that neither of them would have understood. Magellan thought he was bringing Christianity and civilization to a benighted people. Lapu-Lapu thought he was defending his home against foreign invaders. Both of them were right in their own ways, and both of them were wrong. The island itself has changed beyond recognition since that April morning in 1521. Mactan is now covered with resorts and factories, its beaches crowded with tourists, its waters trafficked by ferries and cargo ships carrying goods between the Philippines and the wider world that Magellan helped to connect it to. The reef where he fell is somewhere beneath the warm, shallow water, the exact spot unknown, the coral that witnessed his death long since dead and regrown 100 times over. The palm trees that watched the battle have been cut down and replaced and cut down again. The people who live there now are the descendants of the people who killed him, and they speak Spanish words mixed with their native tongue, and they worship in churches built on the ruins of temples older than Europe. This is what it means to change history. The consequences of that April morning rippled outward in ways that neither Magellan nor Lapu-Lapu could have imagined, spreading across oceans and centuries like the wake of a stone dropped into still water. But to understand those consequences fully, we must first reckon with what the voyage itself had demonstrated, the knowledge it had carried back to Europe in the salt-stained hull of the Victoria. Knowledge that would reshape not just maps, but minds. When Juan Sebastian Elcano brought his battered ship into the harbor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda on that September day in 1522, the 18 survivors who stumbled down the gangplank were carrying more than their cargo of cloves. They were carrying proof. Proof that the earth was round, which had been theorized for millennia but never empirically demonstrated by human travel. Proof that all the world's oceans were connected, that a ship could sail from any coast and eventually return to its starting point. Proof that the Pacific existed and was incomprehensibly vast, far larger than any previous estimate. Proof that the world itself was larger than Ptolemy had calculated, larger than Columbus had believed, larger than any European mind had been prepared to accept. This last fact was perhaps the most unsettling. The classical geographers had underestimated the Earth's circumference by roughly 30%. Columbus had compounded the error, convincing himself that the Western Ocean between Europe and Asia was narrow enough to be crossed in a few weeks. Magellan had known better. His years in the East had given him a more accurate sense of Asian geography. But even he had badly misjudged the Pacific's width. The 98 days of starvation and death his men endured crossing that ocean had burned the truth into their bodies, a truth they carried home in their hollow cheeks and scurvy-loosened teeth. The world was bigger than anyone had thought. The distances were greater. The task of encompassing it would be harder. And yet the Victoria had done it. That fragile wooden shell, no longer than a tennis court, had sailed through waters never before touched by a European keel and had returned to tell the tale. If one ship could do it, others could follow. The impossible had become merely difficult. The immediate effect on European cartography was profound. Within years of the Victoria's return, mapmakers were redrawing the world. The great globe that the Nuremberg cartographer Johann Schöner produced in 1523, incorporated the expedition's discoveries, showing for the first time a reasonably accurate representation of South America's southern tip and the vast Pacific beyond. The Diogo Ribeiro world map of 1529, produced for the Spanish court, was more accurate still, showing the true positions of the Moluccas and the Philippines based on observations made by Magellan's navigators. For the first time, the rough shape of the entire planet was becoming visible to European eyes. But the geographical knowledge was only part of what the expedition had returned with. Pigafetta's journal, which he presented to the Emperor Charles upon his return, contained page after page of observations about the peoples and places the fleet had encountered, descriptions of the Patagonians and their peculiar boots, accounts of the rituals and customs of the islanders in the Marianas and the Philippines, vocabularies of Malay and Tagalog and half a dozen other languages painstakingly recorded phonetically, drawings of unfamiliar animals and plants, notes on the astronomical phenomena visible in southern skies, constellations unknown to European observers, including the great star clouds that would later be named the Magellanic Clouds, in honor of the captain who first recorded them. This was the beginning of something new in European intellectual life, the systematic collection of ethnographic and natural historical data from around the world. The medieval traveler had brought back wonders and marvels, stories designed to astonish and entertain. Pigafetta was doing something different. He was attempting to record accurately, to describe what he had seen without embellishment, to create a reliable account that could be used by future travelers and scholars. His journal was not perfect. It contained errors and misunderstandings, as any such document must. But its intention was scientific in a way that earlier travel narratives had not been. The Circumnavigation had demonstrated not only that the world could be encompassed physically, but that it could begin to be encompassed intellectually, that the diversity of human societies and natural phenomena could be catalogued and compared and understood. The political consequences of the voyage unfolded more slowly, but they were no less significant. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 by Spain and Portugal under papal mediation, had divided the newly discovered world between the two Iberian powers along a line drawn through the Atlantic. Everything west of the line belonged to Spain, everything east belonged to Portugal. But the treaty had said nothing about where that line fell on the other side of the globe, in the waters between Asia and the Americas. The question had been academic, as long as no one knew what lay in those waters. Now it was urgent. Spain claimed that the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, fell within its sphere of influence on the Spanish side of the Anti-Meridian. Portugal disagreed violently. The question was not merely territorial, but commercial. The spice trade was one of the most lucrative enterprises in the world, and whichever power controlled the sources of nutmeg, mace, and clove would reap enormous profits. Astronomers and cartographers were summoned to argue the case before royal courts. The longitudinal position of the Moluccas was debated with an intensity that seems almost absurd today, given how imprecise the instruments of the era were. In the end, the question was settled not by science, but by commerce. In 1529, Spain sold its claims to the Moluccas to Portugal for 350,000 ducats, retaining only its rights to the Philippines, which would become the center of Spanish power in Asia for the next 3 centuries. The Philippines. Those islands that Magellan had reached in the final weeks of his life, where he had converted a king to Christianity and died trying to convert another. They would become one of the most enduring legacies of his voyage, though he could not have known it. Spanish ships began arriving regularly in the 1560s, establishing the colony that would persist until the Spanish-American War of 1898. Manila became one of the great trading cities of the early modern world, the western terminus of the famous Manila galleon trade, in which Chinese silk and porcelain were carried across the Pacific to Mexico and traded for American silver that flowed back to China, creating one of the first truly global circuits of commerce. This was the world that Magellan had helped to create, though he had not lived to see it. His death on Mactan came just as the outlines of that world were becoming visible, just as the connections between Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas were being forged into a single system. He had opened a door, and through that door would flow missionaries and merchants, soldiers and settlers, enslaved people and indentured servants, epidemic diseases and new food crops, ideas and technologies that would transform every society they touched. The transformation was not gentle. It could not have been. The forces that drove European expansion were not charitable forces. They sought profit, power, conversion, dominion. The peoples who found themselves on the receiving end of that expansion experienced it as invasion, as dispossession, as catastrophe. The indigenous peoples of the Americas died in numbers that still defy comprehension. Perhaps 90% of the pre-contact population wiped out within a century of Columbus's arrival, killed by smallpox and measles and typhus against which they had no immunity. The peoples of Africa were enslaved by the millions and transported across the Atlantic to labor on plantations that produced sugar and cotton and tobacco for European markets. The societies of Asia, older and more powerful than their American counterparts, resisted more effectively, but were gradually drawn into a world system whose rules were set by European powers. Magellan did not cause this. The forces that produced it were already in motion before he was born. But he was one of the men who made it possible, who opened the routes along which it traveled, who demonstrated that the world could be crossed and that its peoples could be reached. His voyage was a hinge on which history turned. Before him, the world was many worlds, separate and largely ignorant of one another. After him, it began to become one world, connected and interdependent and increasingly dominated by a handful of European states that had found ways to project their power across oceanic distances. The men who sailed with him understood only dimly what they had accomplished. Pigafetta, perhaps the most reflective of them, wrote near the end of his journal that he hoped future generations would remember the expedition and honor the men who had undertaken it. He seems to have sensed that something epical had occurred, that the world would never be the same. But he could not have imagined how thoroughly his voyage would be absorbed into the larger processes of global transformation, how quickly the feat of circumnavigation would become routine rather than miraculous, how soon the Pacific that Magellan had named would be crisscrossed by shipping lanes and dotted with colonial outposts. Within 50 years of the Victoria's return, European ships were present in every ocean. The Portuguese had consolidated their control over the Indian Ocean trade routes and were establishing footholds in Japan and China. The Spanish had conquered the Aztec and Inca empires and were extracting the silver that would fuel European commerce for generations. The English and the Dutch were beginning to challenge Iberian dominance, building their own trading companies and colonial ventures. The world that Magellan had helped to open was being divided among the powers that could project the most force, claim the most territory, extract the most wealth. The Spice Islands themselves, those tiny volcanic specks in the eastern Indonesian archipelago that had drawn Magellan across the world, became prizes to be fought over. The Portuguese held them for most of the 16th century, then lost them to the Dutch East India Company in the early 17th. The Dutch, with characteristic ruthlessness, established a monopoly over the spice trade so complete that they uprooted and destroyed nutmeg and clove trees on any island they did not control, executing the local populations who resisted. The spices that had once been worth their weight in gold became merely expensive, then commonplace, then almost forgotten as the world moved on to other obsessions. Today, you can buy nutmeg at any grocery store for a few dollars a jar. The Moluccas have returned to obscurity, their moment at the center of world history long past. But the connections that were forged during that moment persist. The trade routes that European ships opened in the 16th century became the channels through which modern globalization flows. The ports they established, Manila, Goa, Cape Town, Havana, Cartagena, remain major cities today. The political boundaries they drew, often arbitrarily and with little regard for local populations, continue to shape the maps of the modern world. The Philippines is a nation because Spain colonized it. Brazil speaks Portuguese because the Treaty of Tordesillas assigned it to Portugal. The United States stretches from Atlantic to Pacific because it purchased Louisiana from France and conquered the Southwest from Mexico and seized the Philippines from Spain in the War of 1898. These facts seem inevitable in retrospect, but they were contingent on decisions made by men who could not have known their consequences, men who sailed wooden ships into unknown waters and sometimes died on distant beaches surrounded by enemies. Magellan was one of those men. His body was never recovered from the reef at Mactan. We do not know what the people of the island did with it, whether they left it for the sea to take, or buried it in some unknown location, or disposed of it in some other way that the sources do not record. His widow, Beatriz, whom he had married in Seville before the voyage, died within a few months of receiving news of his death, and their infant son died shortly after. His direct line ended. The name Magellan persisted only through collateral relatives and through the fame attached to the strait and the voyage. That fame has been complicated, contested, reinterpreted over the centuries. In Spain, he was long remembered as a traitor, a Portuguese who had renounced his homeland and entered the service of a rival power. In Portugal, he was remembered as an unpatriotic adventurer who had sold his services to the highest bidder. In the Philippines, where his legacy is perhaps most directly felt, he has been viewed through multiple lenses, as a bringer of Christianity, as a colonial invader, as a figure of historical importance whose significance lies in what he began rather than what he intended. The monument on Mactan, with its dual tribute to Magellan and Lapu-Lapu, captures something of this complexity. It was erected in 1941, during the final years of American colonial rule in the Philippines, when the question of Filipino national identity was becoming increasingly urgent. The monument's inscription treats both men as worthy of honor, Magellan for his courage and historical significance, Lapu-Lapu for his resistance to foreign domination. This framing has been controversial. Some Filipinos argue that Lapu-Lapu should be honored alone, that Magellan was an invader who deserved his fate. Others argue that the monument appropriately acknowledges the complexity of history, the way that significant events often involve multiple actors with legitimate but conflicting claims. Lapu-Lapu himself has become a national hero in the Philippines, one of the first Filipinos to resist European colonization. His image appears on the Philippine peso. Statues of him stand in public squares, streets and provinces, and a species of fish are named for him. He's become a symbol of indigenous resistance, of the refusal to submit, of the assertion that the peoples who lived in these islands before the Europeans arrived had their own dignity and their own right to self-determination. The fact that his resistance ultimately failed, that the Spanish returned, that the Philippines was colonized for more than 3 centuries, that even now the echoes of that colonization persist in the language and religion and social structures of Filipino society, does not diminish his symbolic importance. He stood up, he fought back, he won. Magellan, for his part, has become a symbol of something else, the human drive to know, to explore, to push beyond the boundaries of the familiar into the unknown. His voyage was motivated by commercial and political concerns, not by pure curiosity, but it required a kind of courage and determination that transcended its immediate purposes. To sail into the strait that now bears his name, not knowing if it had an outlet, not knowing what lay beyond, required a willingness to risk everything on an idea. To hold a starving, mutinous fleet together across 98 days of empty ocean required a force of will that borders on the terrifying. Whatever else Magellan was, colonialist, crusader, servant of empire, he was also a man who dared to do what no one had done before, and who paid for that daring with his life. The 18 survivors who returned aboard the Victoria were the first human beings to have traveled around the entire world. They had left Spain as part of an expedition led by a Portuguese captain serving a Spanish king. They returned as ghosts of that expedition, skeletal and haunted, carrying a cargo of cloves and a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. They had seen the southern stars and the Pacific swells. They had eaten rats and leather and palm pith. They had watched their companions die of scurvy and dysentery and native spears. They had sailed through waters where sea monsters were rumored to dwell and found only emptiness, an expanse of blue so vast that it mocked their maps and their expectations. When they arrived in the Cape Verde Islands on the Portuguese-controlled coast of Africa, they discovered something that disturbed them deeply. Their meticulous log, which they had kept throughout the voyage, indicated that it was Wednesday, but the Portuguese authorities in Cape Verde insisted it was Thursday. The survivors had lost a day. They had sailed continuously westward, following the sun, and in doing so, they had lost 24 hours somewhere in the immensity of the ocean. It took them some time to understand what had happened. By circumnavigating the globe in the direction of the sun's apparent motion, they had experienced one fewer sunrise than had occurred in Europe during their absence. They had discovered, through direct experience, a consequence of living on a spinning sphere that no one had previously observed. The day you lose, or gain, by traveling around the world. This phenomenon would later be formalized as the need for an international dateline, an imaginary boundary in the Pacific where the calendar changes. Magellan's men stumbled upon it without understanding it, their lost Wednesday, a small mystery to add to all the others. The Victoria herself did not long survive her triumph. She was sent on subsequent voyages to the Caribbean and eventually wrecked somewhere in the Atlantic, her timbers scattered, her memory preserved only in documents and in the imagination of those who came after. Of the other ships in Magellan's fleet, only traces remain, a few artifacts, some contested archaeological sites, nothing certain. They have returned to the elements from which they were made, wood and iron and rope and tar, all of it long since dissolved into the earth and the sea. But the knowledge they carried has not dissolved. It has been absorbed into the collective understanding of humanity, so thoroughly incorporated that it is difficult to imagine a time before it existed. We know the world is round because Magellan's men proved it with their bodies. We know the Pacific is vast because they starved crossing it. We know the earth can be encompassed because they encompassed it. These are facts that seem as solid and unchangeable as the ground beneath our feet, but they were not always facts. There was a time, within the span of recorded history, when they were discoveries, when they were news, when they changed forever how human beings understood the planet they lived upon. The year 1522, when the Victoria returned to Spain, marked a threshold in human history. Before that year, no one knew for certain that the world was a single connected sphere. After that year, everyone who cared to know could know it. The age of truly unknown oceans was ending. The age of global connection, with all its benefits and all its costs, its commerce and its exploitation, its cross-pollination of ideas and its transmission of diseases, its possibilities for cooperation and its opportunities for domination, was beginning. Magellan did not live to see that threshold crossed. He died on the far side of the world from the home he had left behind, on a beach he had no reason to visit, in a fight he had no need to start. He was impulsive at the end, as if his long patience had finally exhausted itself, as if the years of waiting and planning and persuading and sailing had left him with nothing but the need to act, to move, to do something decisive, even if that something was a mistake. The mistake cost him his life. It nearly cost the expedition its survival. And yet, the expedition survived him, limped homeward across half the globe, and delivered to humanity knowledge that could never be unlearned. The waves still wash over the coral at Mactan. The palm trees still bend in the wind that blows endlessly across the Philippine Sea. The descendants of the people who killed Magellan live there still, in houses built on reclaimed land, working in factories and hotels, their children speaking languages that their ancestors of 1521 would not have recognized. Somewhere beneath the warm, shallow water, in a location that no one can identify with certainty, the calcium of Ferdinand Magellan's bones has long since dissolved into the reef, become part of the coral, become part of the ocean that he named. He asked the sea for passage, and it gave him passage. He asked for glory, and it gave him something else, a death that became a beginning, a defeat that became a victory, a life that ended in failure and was remembered as triumph. The world he opened has not finished revealing its consequences. 5 centuries after his death, ships still pass through the strait he discovered, their crews barely noticing the dark cliffs and glacier-streaked valleys that nearly stopped him forever. Aircraft crossed the Pacific in hours, their passengers watching movies, unaware that the ocean beneath them was once the widest emptiness any human had ever crossed. The century that followed the Victoria's return would transform the world Magellan had helped to open. Spanish galleons would soon ply the route he had pioneered, crossing the Pacific in great annual convoys from Manila to Acapulco, carrying Chinese silk and porcelain westward to the markets of Mexico and Peru, carrying Mexican silver eastward to the treasuries of the Ming dynasty. The trade would continue for 250 years, the longest continuous maritime route in the history of commerce, and it would bind together 3 continents in a web of exchange that had never existed before. The Philippines would become a Spanish colony, its peoples converted to Christianity by the same faith that Magellan had carried in his heart across the endless ocean. The Moluccas, those tiny volcanic islands where the cloves grew, would become the prize in a decades-long struggle between Portugal and Spain, until eventually both empires faded, and the Dutch arrived to claim the spice trade for themselves. And the world that had seemed so vast to Magellan's starving crew, so impossibly wide as they drifted across the Pacific eating leather and weevils, would begin to shrink, to become knowable, to submit itself to the charts and calculations of European navigators who followed where the Victoria had led. But these consequences lay hidden in the future, on that September day in 1522, when the battered ship crept into the harbor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, her sails patched, her hull leaking, her crew too weak to stand at attention for the officials who came aboard to inspect her cargo. The 18 survivors who stumbled down her gangplank were not thinking of empires or trade routes or the transformation of human geography. They were thinking of food, of water, of beds that did not roll with the endless motion of the sea, of the faces of wives and children they had not seen in 3 years and had never expected to see again. Some of them would receive rewards from the Spanish crown. Elcano was granted a coat of arms featuring a globe encircled by a ribbon bearing the words, "Primus circumdediste me," "You first encircled me." Others would slip back into obscurity, their names preserved only in the expedition's muster rolls and pay records. A few would write accounts of what they had seen, adding their voices to the single most important source, the journal of Antonio Pigafetta, who had survived against all odds and returned with his notes intact, ready to present them to the courts of Europe. Pigafetta's account would be copied, translated, excerpted, and studied for centuries. It would provide the foundation for nearly everything we know about the voyage, the discovery of the strait, the crossing of the Pacific, the first contact with the peoples of the Philippines, and the death of the captain on the beach at Mactan. But Pigafetta was not a neutral observer. He was a devoted follower of Magellan, and his journal reflects that devotion. He portrays his captain as a man of courage, wisdom, and piety, betrayed by mutinous subordinates and brought low by an excessive confidence at the very moment of his triumph. Other accounts, particularly those written by the Spanish officers who had clashed with Magellan throughout the voyage, tell a different story. They describe a man who was secretive, suspicious, and quick to punish, who favored his Portuguese companions over the Spanish majority of the crew, and who led the expedition into disaster through stubbornness and pride. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the tangle of competing testimonies, impossible to disentangle with certainty. What we can say is that Magellan was a man of his time, shaped by the particular circumstances of early 16th century Iberia. He came of age in an era when the boundaries of the known world were expanding at a pace unprecedented in human history, when the sons of minor nobility could make their fortunes by sailing into the unknown and returning with tales of lands no European had ever seen. He was trained in the rigorous school of Portuguese seamanship, which had developed over the course of a century into the most advanced maritime tradition in the world. He learned to read the stars, to calculate latitude from the height of the sun, to understand the patterns of wind and current that governed movement across the open ocean. And he absorbed the fierce religiosity of the Iberian crusading tradition, the conviction that Christian expansion was not merely profitable, but divinely ordained, a continuation of the centuries-long struggle against Islam that had shaped the Iberian Peninsula. This religiosity was not incidental to Magellan's character. It was central to it. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man of genuine piety, who attended Mass daily, who kept a chaplain in his household even during his years of disgrace in Portugal, and who believed with complete sincerity that his voyage was a service to God as well as to the Spanish crown. When he reached the Philippines and began converting the local chieftains to Christianity, he was not merely engaging in a political strategy. He was fulfilling what he understood to be his sacred duty, spreading the faith to peoples who had never heard the gospel, saving souls that would otherwise be lost to damnation. This conviction explains, at least in part, the strange rashness of his final days. Having spent 2 years nursing his ships across half the world, exercising patience and caution that bordered on the miraculous, he arrived in the Philippines and suddenly seemed unable to wait. He had found souls to save, pagans to convert, enemies of the faith to punish. The prudence that had carried him through the strait and across the Pacific deserted him at the moment when he needed it most. The expedition he left behind was in desperate straits. Of the original 5 ships, only 2 remained afloat, and both were damaged and undermanned. The crew, which had numbered 270 at departure, had been reduced by death, desertion, and disease to perhaps 115 survivors. They had reached the Spice Islands, the goal of all their suffering, but they faced a journey of 15,000 miles to return home through waters controlled by the Portuguese, who regarded them as trespassers and would treat them as pirates if they caught them. The officers who now commanded the expedition, Gonzalo Gomez de Espinosa on the Trinidad, Juan Sebastián Elcano on the Victoria, were capable seamen, but they lacked Magellan's single-minded vision, his absolute certainty that the voyage could and would succeed. They would have to find their own certainty now, or the expedition would fail within sight of its goal. They spent several months in the Moluccas, trading for cloves, repairing their ships, and negotiating with local rulers who were happy to sell spices to anyone willing to pay for them, regardless of whether the Portuguese approved. By December of 1521, they were ready to depart. But here, the expedition split, a final division that would doom one ship and save the other. Espinosa, commanding the Trinidad, chose to attempt the Pacific crossing in reverse, sailing east toward Spanish America. It was a logical choice in some ways. The route was shorter on paper, and it would avoid the Portuguese entirely, but it proved disastrous. The Trinidad spent months fighting contrary winds and currents, lost half her crew to scurvy and starvation, and was eventually captured by the Portuguese, who imprisoned the survivors and confiscated the cargo. Espinosa himself would spend years in Portuguese prisons before finally returning to Spain, broken and penniless, a footnote to a voyage he had helped to lead. Elcano made the other choice. He took the Victoria west into the Indian Ocean, following the route that Portuguese ships had traveled for decades. It was dangerous. He would have to slip past every Portuguese fortress and trading post between the Moluccas and the Cape of Good Hope, but it was at least a known route, with favorable winds and currents. He set out in December with a crew of about 60 men, a ship that leaked steadily, and a hold full of cloves that represented the entire profit of the expedition. For the next 9 months he sailed west, avoiding Portuguese-controlled ports, stopping only when absolutely necessary for water and supplies, trusting to speed and luck to carry him home. The voyage of the Victoria from the Spice Islands to Spain was in some ways as remarkable as the Pacific crossing that had preceded it. Elcano navigated without reliable charts, in seas that the Spanish had never sailed, dependent on his own skill and the fragmentary knowledge he had acquired during his years as a working seaman. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope in May of 1522, fighting through the same brutal storms that had threatened every ship that had ever attempted the passage. He crept up the Atlantic coast of Africa, past the mouths of rivers that emptied into the sea from a continent whose interior remained utterly unknown to Europeans. His crew died steadily, of scurvy, of fever, of simple exhaustion. When the ship finally reached the Cape Verde Islands, a Portuguese possession where Elcano hoped to take on supplies, he tried to conceal his identity and the nature of his voyage, but the ruse was discovered, and several of his men were arrested. He fled without them, leaving them to Portuguese imprisonment, and sailed the final leg to Spain with a crew of barely 20 men, several of whom died in the last weeks of the voyage. The Victoria's cargo of cloves, when it was finally unloaded and sold, more than covered the cost of the entire expedition. The 5 ships, the supplies, the wages of 270 men for 3 years. All of it was repaid by a single hold full of dried flower buds from the Moluccas. This fact, perhaps more than any other, explains why the age of exploration happened. It was not curiosity that drove men to sail into the unknown, or not curiosity alone. It was profit. The spice trade was the petroleum industry of the 16th century, the source of fortune so vast that no risk seemed too great, no suffering too extreme. Men endured the horrors of the Pacific crossing, the scurvy and the starvation and the endless empty sea, because a single successful voyage could make them wealthy beyond imagination. The tragedy is that so few of them lived to enjoy that wealth. Elcano received his coat of arms, his pension, his moment of royal favor. He would die 4 years later, in 1526, during a second expedition to the Moluccas, his body buried at sea somewhere in the Pacific that Magellan had discovered and named. Pigafetta would retire to his native Italy, write his memoir, and vanish into obscurity. The other survivors scattered to the winds, their stories lost to history. Only the voyage itself remained, growing larger in memory with each passing year, becoming the foundational myth of the global age that was being born. The consequences of that voyage rippled outward through the centuries in ways that Magellan could never have imagined. The strait he discovered became, for 300 years, one of the most strategically important waterways in the world, the only known passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific until the discovery of the Drake Passage to the south. Ships of every nation would eventually pass through those dark, cold waters: Spanish galleons, English privateers, Dutch merchantmen, American whalers, British warships. Each of them would navigate the same treacherous channels that Magellan had found by persistence and luck, would see the same glacier-streaked mountains rising from the sea, would feel the same Willowall winds shrieking down from the ice fields. The fires that Magellan had seen burning on the southern shore would give way, eventually, to lighthouses, to coaling stations, to the small settlements of a new nation called Chile that would claim both shores of the strait as its own. The Pacific that Magellan had named would become, over the following centuries, the stage for some of the most consequential events in human history. European powers would carve it up, claiming islands, establishing colonies, fighting wars that would reshape the political geography of the world. The peoples who lived on those islands, the descendants of navigators who had crossed the ocean thousands of years before Magellan was born, would find themselves subject to forces they had never imagined. Missionaries and merchants, soldiers and settlers, diseases and doctrines that would transform their societies beyond recognition. The ocean that had seemed so empty to Magellan's crew, so terrifyingly void of land or life, would be revealed as a world unto itself, scattered with thousands of inhabited islands, home to cultures of remarkable sophistication and diversity. None of this was apparent in 1521. To the Europeans who first crossed that ocean, it was simply a barrier, an obstacle, a space to be traversed as quickly as possible on the way to somewhere else. The Philippines, where Magellan died, would become one of the most enduring legacies of his voyage. Spain would return in force 4 decades after his death, establishing a colonial presence that would last for more than 300 years. Manila would grow into one of the great trading cities of Asia, the western terminus of the galleon route, the point where silver flowed from the Americas to China and silk flowed from China to the Americas. The descendants of the people who had killed Magellan would be baptized, educated in Spanish, governed by Spanish law. They would fight for Spain, die for Spain, and eventually, in 1898, rise up against Spain, only to be conquered again by a new empire from across the Pacific. The history of the Philippines is, in many ways, the history of what Magellan's voyage made possible, a world in which no island was too remote, no people too isolated to be drawn into the currents of global power. And what of Lapu-Lapu, the chieftain who killed Magellan? He has become, in the centuries since that morning on the beach, something that Magellan never became. A symbol of resistance, a hero of anti-colonial struggle, a figure whose meaning has grown larger than his life. In the Philippines today, he is honored as the first Filipino to resist Western imperialism, a warrior who stood up to the technologically superior invaders and drove them back into the sea. Statues of him stand in parks and plazas across the archipelago. His name is given to schools, to streets, to the city that now occupies the island where he fought. He's been claimed by nationalists and revolutionaries, by those who see in his victory proof that the colonizers were not invincible, that resistance was possible, that the future was not predetermined. The irony is that Lapu-Lapu himself would not have recognized any of these meanings. He was not fighting Western imperialism. He did not know what the West was. He was not defending Filipino nationhood. There was no Filipino nation in 1521, only a patchwork of chieftains and kingdoms speaking dozens of languages, owing allegiance to no one beyond their own islands. He was a local ruler, defending his local prerogatives against what he perceived as an intrusion by outsiders allied with his rivals. His victory at Mactan was a small event in the politics of the Philippine archipelago, significant mainly because it removed a troublesome foreigner from the scene. That it became something more, that it was later woven into the narrative of national identity and anti-colonial resistance, is a testament to the way history works. How events are claimed, reinterpreted, and transformed by the generations that inherit them. The monument that stands today near the site of the battle commemorates both men. One plaque honors Magellan as the leader of the first circumnavigation of the globe. Another honors Lapu-Lapu as the defender of his people against foreign aggression. They stand together, European navigator and island chieftain, linked forever by a few minutes of violence on a coral reef in 1521. Neither could have imagined what their encounter would come to mean. Neither could have known that he was participating in one of the hinge moments of human history, when two worlds that had evolved separately for tens of thousands of years were beginning to collide. The world that emerged from that collision is the world we live in now. It is a world in which no place is truly remote, in which information and goods and people flow continuously across the boundaries that once seemed absolute, in which the Pacific is crossed in hours rather than months, in which the spices that men once died for can be purchased for pennies in any supermarket. It is a world that was unimaginable before Magellan sailed, and inevitable after he did. The door he opened could not be closed. The knowledge the Victoria carried home could not be unlearned. Once humanity knew that the earth could be encompassed, that the oceans were connected, that every shore could be reached from every other shore, the rest followed with a logic that seems, in retrospect, almost mechanical. The age of isolated civilizations was ending. The age of global connection was beginning. The costs of that transition are still being tallied. The peoples who lived in the path of European expansion in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific, paid those costs in blood and suffering that cannot be measured. Diseases carried by European ships killed tens of millions. Slavery and forced labor killed millions more. Cultures were destroyed, languages were lost, ways of life that had endured for centuries were swept away in a generation. These are facts that the triumphalist narrative of exploration and discovery tends to obscure, but they are facts nonetheless. The circumnavigation of the globe was an achievement, perhaps the greatest achievement of the age of sail, but it was an achievement built on a foundation of violence and exploitation that cannot be ignored or wished away. Magellan himself is a difficult figure to judge by modern standards, and perhaps the attempt is futile. He was a man of his time, driven by motives that made sense within the framework of 16th century Iberia: loyalty to crown and faith, desire for wealth and honor, belief in the divine sanction of Christian expansion. He showed courage that bordered on the reckless, patience that bordered on the obsessive, determination that bordered on the fanatical. He drove his men harder than any captain before him, kept secrets from his own officers, punished mutiny with death, and held the expedition together through storms and starvation by the sheer force of his will. He also led that expedition to disaster, threw away his life in a battle he did not need to fight, and left his successors to complete a voyage he himself had never intended to make. Whether to call him a hero or a villain, a genius or a fool, depends entirely on which part of the story one chooses to emphasize. Perhaps the truest thing we can say about him is that he was necessary. The voyage could not have happened without someone like him, someone stubborn enough to persist through years of rejection, skilled enough to find the strait and cross the Pacific, charismatic enough to hold a mutinous crew together through circumstances that should have destroyed them. Whether we call that necessity heroism or fanaticism, whether we celebrate his achievement or mourn its costs, the fact remains that he did what no one before him had done. He found the Western Passage. He crossed the unknown ocean. He brought his expedition to the edge of the world it had set out to find. And if he died there, on a beach he should never have set foot upon, that death does not erase what he accomplished. It merely makes it more human, more contingent, more shaped by the randomness and tragedy that characterize all human endeavor. The calcium of his bones has long since dissolved into the coral reef at Mactan. The ships that carried him across 3 oceans have rotted away to nothing. The empire he served has risen and fallen, its colonies scattered to the winds, its language spoken by hundreds of millions who have never heard of Ferdinand Magellan. The strait that bears his name still carries ships, smaller and more specialized now, tourists mostly, who come to see the place where the world was opened. The Pacific still stretches from horizon to horizon, vaster than any ocean, crossed now by container ships and airliners and the cables that carry the internet from continent to continent. The world he encompassed has not stopped expanding. It has become more connected, more entangled, more bound together by trade and technology and the movements of people than he could ever have imagined. And somewhere, in the archives of Seville, in the great repository of documents that chronicled the Spanish Empire, the original log of the Victoria still exists. Its pages are brown with age, fragile to the touch, covered with the cramped handwriting of navigators who died 5 centuries ago. It records the latitudes they measured, the winds they encountered, the islands they sighted, the men who died along the way. It does not record what they thought or felt as they crossed the vast Pacific, as they watched their companions die of scurvy, as they ate the leather from the rigging to stay alive. It does not record the moment when they realized they would survive, or the moment when they first sighted the coast of Spain after 3 years away. It records only the facts, the dates, the distances, the numbers. Everything else, the suffering, the courage, the hope, the despair, must be imagined. But imagination is a form of memory, and memory is how we keep faith with the dead. The men who sailed on the Victoria are gone, their bodies dissolved into the oceans they crossed, their names forgotten except by historians. But what they did remains. The knowledge they carried home has become so fundamental to how we understand the world that it is invisible, like air or gravity. We do not notice it because we cannot imagine its absence. We cannot imagine a world in which the Earth's roundness was a theory rather than a fact, in which the Pacific was an unknown void on the edge of every map, in which the question of whether you could sail west from Europe and arrive in the East remained unanswered. That world existed. It existed until September of 1522, when 18 men on a leaking ship sailed back into the harbor they had left 3 years before, and proved with their bodies that the Earth was a sphere, that the oceans were connected, that humanity's home was a single world rather than a collection of isolated fragments. Magellan did not live to see that moment. He died on a beach, surrounded by enemies, his armor filling with seawater, his vision going dark. He had sailed farther west than any European before him. He had given the Pacific its name. He had found the strait that generations of explorers had sought. And he had died in a fight he could have avoided, on an island he did not need to visit, 8,000 miles from the home he had left behind and would never see again. The sea took him, as the sea takes everyone who trusts it long enough. The coral preserved him for a while, then dissolved him into itself, then became something else entirely. The reef at Mactan is older now than it was in 1521, built up by 5 centuries of new growth, shaped by currents and storms that Magellan never saw. Somewhere in that reef, perhaps, there are molecules that were once part of his body, calcium that was once his bones, carbon that was once his blood. They have been absorbed into the structure of the living reef, become part of something larger than any single life. passed through the bodies of fish and coral in the warm, shallow water that washes endlessly over the beach where he fell. He asked the sea for passage, and it gave him passage. He asked the world for proof that it could be encompassed, and the world gave him that proof, though he did not live to see it. The Victoria came home without him, bearing the knowledge he had died to discover, and that knowledge changed everything. The waves still break on the reef at Mactan. The palm trees still bend in the wind. The world is still round, still connected, still smaller and more entangled than it was before a Portuguese nobleman sailed west into the unknown and never returned. He has been sleeping in the coral for 500 years. The world he opened has not yet finished becoming what he made it.